Well, hello, I'm Heather Granato. I'm the president of Women in Nutraceuticals, and thank you for joining us today for our WIN webinar, Gender Disparity in Nutritional Science Research, a case study with omega-3s. We are so delighted to have worked with GoEd on this topic. Our speaker today will be Kaitlin Roke, PhD. She's the Director of Scientific Communication and Outreach at GoEd. And GoEd is, as I said, an association partner for Women in Nutraceuticals. As we get started, we're going to have a little pop-up that will show up to do a little poll. We'd love to know where you're from. So if you have a chance to participate in our poll, that will let us know who you are. And hopefully we'll be able to tailor our presentation and the information we share with you. And obviously that helps us as we're developing more content from WIN for future updates and opportunities. All right, we'll let that poll just be up there. So Women in Nutraceuticals, here we go. I'm viewing the poll results. A lot of people in management, product development, some marketing and C-suite, and some students. Will welcome to all of you for being here today. Women in Nutraceuticals, we are a global not-for-profit organization that was started at the beginning of 2022. A lot of men and women who came together and said that what we were looking for was a way to achieve economic and societal equity to change the global nutraceutical industry. And really, our membership is open to men and women who are on board with our mission of empowering women in nutraceuticals to unlock their personal and professional potential. We've got really different pillars, our focus areas. So we're looking to increase the number of women on corporate boards, leading in the C-suite and serving in executive leadership, to expand the investment opportunities for women-owned and led businesses, and to ensure the growth of women in science and women's health research across the nutraceutical industry, an interesting area we'll be delving into today, and certainly ensuring better opportunities for rising female leaders. Today, however, we're going to turn things over to Kaitlin Roke. She is the Director of Scientific Communication and Outreach. She has a long history of nutritional research and actually was working with GoEd to develop this fantastic research database that looks at long-chain omega-3s and research. So I am going to stop sharing my screen. And Kaitlin, I'm going to bring you on board. There we go.
Thank you very much, Heather. Let me share my screen. Okay, just adjusting my windows over here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so thank you so much for the warm introduction, as well as the warm welcome to participate in the second WIN webinar. So really pleased to be here today to talk about a subject that is personally and professionally really relevant and important to me. So this webinar, as Heather said, is a WIN and GoEd webinar. So GoEd is a partner with WIN. And today the topic of the presentation will be gender disparity in nutritional science research, a case study with omega-3s. There we go. So we've already introduced ourselves. So thank you very much, Heather, for having me. And as Heather said, I'm with GoEd and I'm the Director of Scientific Communication and Outreach. And as Heather also mentioned, I've actually been working with GoEd for even longer than my official position here. So I've been with GoEd formally for 1 year. But prior to that, I started with GoEd as on a contract basis and worked to develop the database. So also a topic really close to my heart and really important to me. So before going any further, I wanted to talk about what GoEd is. So it's a short acronym, but a pretty long name. So sometimes hard to squeeze into an elevator pitch, but we try our best. So GoEd is the global organization for EPA and DHA Omega-3s. And it's an omega-3 trade association. and we reach 180 members globally. And so our members range from fisheries to algae producers to oil refiners to finished products like supplements as well as food. So we really kind of sit in the middle of the industry and support everything along the EPA and DHA omega-3 supply chain. So this gives us a great opportunity to get to know what's going on throughout the world in terms of omega-3 science, regulatory, etc. And the goals that we have at GoEd are also shared with our members. And so we have a goal to increase the awareness of the science-backed benefits of EPA and DHA omega-3s and ensure the industry is producing quality products that people can trust. So we want to make sure that consumers trust the products that they're buying. The stronger that we have as an omega-3 industry, the stronger the consumer trust. And so the GoEd members adhere to a monograph that has a very high, the highest in the industry standard for quality of their omega-3 products. You can find us online in several places if you wanted to learn more. So on the GoEd website, there's a lot of information and resources and lots of information for our members specifically. We also have a consumer-facing website and lots of information, infographics. There's a quiz to see if you're getting enough omega-3s in your diet. And lastly, we have a healthcare practitioner website where we share research and more information for healthcare practitioners. Okay, so no small task today. 5 really important topics to discuss. As I was preparing for this presentation, I quickly realized that I probably could have spoken for 2 hours or more on this topic, but we're going to keep it to around 30 minutes. So really brief discussion on each of these topics. And I'll start by talking about gender disparity in medical science. So I'll try and start kind of the bottom of the triangle and go narrow. So then we'll talk about including pregnant and lactating women in clinical trials. We'll talk about women's health versus maternal health. We'll talk about gender disparity in nutritional science broadly, and then specifically talk about women's health considerations for lipid science research. Okay, so we'll start by talking about gender disparity in medical science. And I have a couple of quotes built into this presentation because I felt like they kind of hit the nail on the head with what they said, and my paraphrasing wasn't doing it any justice. So I have a few quotes that I think really kind of hit the topic home for me. So according to the Global Gender Gap Report in 2022, improvements in women's health and well-being are key to closing the gender gap, with reproductive and maternal health a priority. Okay, good. We're feeling good about this statement. Happy, glad it's included. And the statement that follows, at current rates, it will take 132 years to close the gender parity gap. Fundamentally different narrative and approach is needed to advance women's health. So this kind of hurt. We've made a lot of progress in the last few years, but clearly we have a long way to go. And I think what we need to consider is how we're going to continue to making these substantial steps forward. So hopefully we can reduce the number from 132 to less, but if we can't, we need to continue at a steady and strong rate to ensure this gap is being addressed. And I also wanted to mention a few things today in this presentation. So especially prevalent or prevalent in the last few years are the conversations about gender fluidity and gender identity. So in this presentation today, I am speaking almost exclusively about women's health and sometimes women versus men's health. So I acknowledge that there might be some populations not appropriately represented in this talk today, and I hope that we can incorporate more research on those groups in the future. I also wanted to acknowledge, and this statement here says that when gender intersects with race and ethnicity, the gender leadership gap is even wider. So I wanted to acknowledge that ethnicity and race also play important roles in the disparity that we see across nutritional science and medical science. And I have a couple of examples built into the presentation that we'll explore. Okay, so a very, very brief history, but I thought it was important to kind of start at the beginning. So this image from 1493, so many, many years ago, it is a painting or a caricature drawing. When we think about medical science, I'm thinking about human anatomy. So we're thinking about early learning in medical science and dissection. And in modern days, dissection happens often in university settings and medical school settings and kind of throughout the learning process. But way, way back, it happened a lot less. And so something that was new information for me is that in the early days of this type of research and learning, most of the cadavers were condemned criminals. Surprise? Okay, maybe makes sense. Didn't know that. Um, and one of the reasons they reported that women were not used as often as cadavers in this type of research was because women were not as often condemned as a criminal. So this was interesting to me. And just, when we're thinking about resources and availability, and this didn't persist over time. So over time, we do see a shift from, if males were the only available cadavers, then it continued that males were the cadavers of choice for this type of research. And in the beginning of the medical science days, a quote that I have here is that women were in essence considered small men. So at the beginning of this physiological and medical science research, the main difference noted were reproductive organs. Otherwise, it was thought that women, everything was a bit smaller, but everything worked the same other than the reproductive organs. So if we're thinking then, moving a little bit closer to present day in terms of medical science learning materials, we see an underrepresentation of women in women in anatomy textbooks. And so this disparity is also evident across ethnicity, age, body type, and health status. And predominantly we see white, young, heterosexual, healthy, muscular men as a standard model and often kind of seen as the apex of evolution in some scientific textbooks. And so this was an interesting research study that I looked at in preparing for this presentation. And they looked at different anatomy textbooks. So they had textbooks from North America and textbooks from Europe. And as you can see, where the sex of the body was known, 17% of the time a male body was used, and 5% of the time a female body was used. So these were cases not specific to reproduction. And the same proportion is shown in the European texts. And when the textbook compared components measuring neutral body parts, 9 out of 12 textbooks only represented Caucasian ethnicity, and 2.7% of textbook images only depicted visibly disabled bodies, and 2.2% of textbook images depicted elderly patients. And so the point that the authors made in this article that I thought was a really important one is that as a medical professional, we're often seeing people who are elderly and people who have differences in their body for health or other reasons. So when people are learning in medical science to only show a muscular, white, healthy man isn't really helping people to understand the whole picture of what they might see in their medical practice. So again, really interesting and striking findings from some of these medical science learning materials. And then I wanted to translate that one step further into medical practice. So again, not an expert, but just learning about this topic and reading some of the studies that have been done. Women wait longer than men, both for diagnosis and pain relief, and are more likely to be misdiagnosed or discharged during a serious medical event. And then I have another quote here that I'll read. The bulk of the cardiovascular clinical trial research has been predicated to men, and this has, in my opinion, served as a medical disservice to women with cardiovascular disease. And I think that this is a topic that comes up often, is that we see differences and contraindications in medication related to heart disease in men and women. And we'll talk about this in a few more slides, but Part of this is because the dosage in medical science studies for pharmacology are or were mostly done in men as well. And so what we're seeing is that women are having different effects, different side effects, different reactions to the medications because they might have only been tested in men. I'm just going to take a second and adjust my screen here on my side. Okay, sorry, I'm just going to stop sharing and then share again. I just have two PowerPoints on my side, and it's hard to get my eyes looking at the right spot. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Hopefully this gives everyone a moment to grab a sip of water. Okay, myself included. All right, back to action here. So the last point that I wanted to make on this slide, also an important
Kaitlin,
one.
I'm so sorry to
Oh,
interrupt you, but your
yes,
slides
sorry.
are actually not displaying for our audience.
Oh,
Would you mind
shoot.
resharing?
Yes, sorry, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, I think this is the Zoom screen, and now I'll fix it too. Okay, how about now, Tracy?
Yep, they're showing. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Sorry, everyone, for the interruption. Just wanted to make sure, yeah, we're back on track. Okay, thank you. The last point on this slide that I wanted to make is where gender intersects with race and ethnicity. So again, from a study that I read, there's a difference in life expectancy that we see between genders, but also when we add ethnicity. So in this particular study, they looked at two different neighborhoods. One neighborhood where 93% of its female population were Black, and the other population in Baltimore where only 6.9% of that particular neighborhood were Black. And the difference in life expectancy between these neighborhoods was 20 years. And this again was very saddening and shocking, and something really important for us to think about and consider in medical practice, how people are treating and seeing these patients. Okay, so I'm going to just take a moment here to look at some historical timelines. So again, we kind of started right at the top, the way back, 1493 or 63, and then we're moving a little bit closer to present day. So I wanted to bring us at least back to the 1960s, where sort of some of this disparity in research became even more prominent. So in 1962 was the thalidomide tragedy. So thalidomide was a drug that was prescribed during pregnancy and led to severe and significant birth defects. And so this drug was, paused, of course, and reevaluated. And this led to a lot of changes in policy in medical science research. And so following that, then in 1975, pregnant women were then noted as vulnerable research subjects. So this meant that if you were conducting a study in pregnant or lactating women, these were considered vulnerable groups. So of course, because of ethics, we want to proceed cautiously with these patient groups. But what ended up happening is that there was kind of a ban for women in early phase clinical research. So because of the ethical considerations and limitations, there was a fairly large gap of time where pregnant and lactating women were not included at all because of potential risks to them or the baby during these studies. So if we fast forward then to 1990, the Office of Research on Women's Health was established at the National Institutes of Health. And in 1993 they called kind of a quote reversal of the 1977 guidelines. So now there was no longer a ban and women could be included again. So just wanted to pause to say that this was in 1993, which was not that many years ago. So that means that there haven't been a lot of years since that we have seen inclusion of pregnant and lactating women in medical science studies. So we'll go a couple of years further. In 1994, there was more attention called to the historical gender bias in the design and implementation of clinical trials. There is now requirements that safety data and efficacy data needed to be presented by sex. And in 2000, again, 23 years ago, a clinical trial could be put on hold if the sponsors excluded men or women only because of reproductive potential. So there's been 20 years since then, but it was really interesting to me to see the progression and chain of events that happened. So I thought this might be relevant for those on the line as well. And so we've sort of started to talk about this conversation. So we saw the exclusion of pregnant and lactating women. And so now we'll talk a little bit about why and how that happened and how the inclusion is being reincorporated. So just a couple of statistics. I know our audience might be global, but this is data that I found from the United States. So approximately 4 million US people give birth annually, and 70% of those take at least one prescription medication during their pregnancy. However, as we just saw, there's been a long period of time where pregnant and lactating persons were not included in clinical trials. So this means that often people who are taking a prescription medication during their pregnancy, there's limited drug-related information on that prescription that they're taking in some cases. And another quote that I have here from a doctor, that including pregnant and lactating individuals in clinical trials is literally a conversation about life or death. And I think this is so important that if we're trying to protect women and their children, that we need to make sure that we're studying them appropriately in medical science so that we can ensure we know about the drugs and medication that they're taking during their pregnancy or during breastfeeding. And then fast forward a little bit further in time. So we're going back to the historical timeline, and the last update from June 2019, the FDA published further guidance on diversity in clinical trials, including the collection of race and ethnicity data, the reporting of age, race, ethnicity-specific data in medical device clinical studies, and including demographic subgroups as participants is strongly encouraged. And I wanted just to note that this is not a requirement to include the subgroups, but just to describe the inclusion or exclusion of them. And so there's been further work done to see, okay, after these regulations and rules, are things actually changing? And we're moving a little bit closer, but we're not quite there yet. So in a study by Geller et al., they looked at 86 randomized controlled trials and found that females are represented in 37% of those studies, with only 3% noting limitations due to lack of diversity. And so this is something that when I was doing my PhD work I started my master's in 2010, it was something that was commonly talked about. So people would say, okay, make sure in your grant that you talk about why you're including or not including women. But what happened was it was just commonly done that you would talk about why you weren't including women. So I worked in a department that was predominantly metabolic health as well as exercise. And it was just a fairly neutral, normal part of the conversation that people would say, okay, I'm recruiting for my next study, but oh, not including women because there's too much variability. Or, yep, I'm doing an exercise study, but oh, well, because of the menstrual cycle, it's, gets a little bit complicated, so we'll just include men. And so it was something that, because of the type of research, it seemed sort of common practice. And in terms of grant writing, as long as you talked about why including women were more difficult or more variable, then that was acceptable. So not to put any, the granting agencies have continued to improve and work since then. It was just interesting anecdote from graduate school where we saw this happening in practice in nutritional science and metabolic research. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about women's health versus maternal health. And so I thought this picture to me was an important one because we have a picture of women, all of which may or may not be of childbearing age. And when we think about the lifespan, of course, pregnancy and lactation is an extremely important point of time in someone's life. But in the grand scheme of our life expectancy, it's a relatively short period of time. So there's a lot of other health and life events that happen from birth to death other than pregnancy and lactation. So I just wanted to acknowledge that there's a lot of other years of life lived other than those times in our life. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's important to consider. And first wanted to just acknowledge that women do have periods and the menstrual cycle does impact health and can't be ignored. So as women, this is not a topic that's comfortable to talk about for some or all. It's not something that is commonly discussed amongst men or women. It's still kind of a little bit taboo, which is unfortunate because it happens every month for most women and is a pretty common phenomenon. But I also, the image that I chose to represent here, when I looked, when I was looking for images, like, yes, it's red. However, it's sparkly and it's pink and it's pretty nice. And so this is sort of how the menstrual cycle is commonly depicted as this, you know, pretty little pink period of time in the month or in your life. So a little bit of pink around this topic here. But the reason to bring this up is that we do have to consider the menstrual cycle. It's not that we can ignore it. There are changes to our health and our hormones on a regular basis. But most of the women's health research to date has been focused on gynecological and reproductive health. But when we think about, again, the span of our life and other things that are happening other than reproduction, in a study that I read, we have data that supports that women are more likely than men to become disabled in their lifetime, have obesity, and have a greater or 20% increased risk of developing heart failure or dying within 5 years of their first severe heart attack. So these are really important considerations for medical support and service that are not related at all to maternal health. Another comparison here when we think about physiological differences across the lifespan, women are more likely than men to be offered minor tranquilizers or antidepressants versus analgesic pain medication, less likely to be referred for further diagnostic investigations, more likely for their pain to be seen as having an emotional or physical cause rather than a biological one, and more likely to be seen as hysterical, which is both historically relevant and currently, and this feeds the image of the attention-seeking hypochondriac patient. So there's a lot of things happening that change medical service, but also change the health of a woman compared to a man when we're thinking outside of the box for reproductive health. So I was only able to talk about that for a moment because there are so many things to cover, but I wanted then to move to gender disparity in nutritional science research. And I've touched on this a little bit, just speaking anecdotally about my experience from graduate school, but we have a couple of examples where this comes up. So I put this image up here, so it's specific to omega-3s, but just reiterating the point that from omega-3s, but other nutrient perspective, these are important all throughout our life. And yes, omega-3s specifically are very important for pregnancy and breastfeeding, but to our knowledge, both men and women have hearts, brains, eyes, most other organs, and omega-3s and other nutrients are critically important for these body systems too. And that means that it's really important to study differences between men and women when we're looking at effects of supplementation, when we're looking at effects of drugs, etc. And so I'm going to spend a minute talking about our clinical study database and give an example of looking at gender from the lens of our database. So this is a sophisticated PubMed academic style search only for EPA and DHA omega-3s. So as I've written on the slide here, there's over 40,000 studies on EPA and DHA. So in the nutrient category, it's fairly extensive and very difficult to find what you're looking for quickly. And so we wanted to create this tool for several different things, but the reason and purpose I used it for today was to identify gaps in the research. But we can also use this tool to gather information from marketing collateral. Perhaps we want to market an omega-3 or other nutritional product for men or women, provide direction in product development, so related to that previous comment, and to more effectively review the science. With this huge amount of research, we want to be able to get to the bottom of our question more quickly. So what we did, I'm not going to be able to show you the tool in action today, but what we did was we jumped into the database and we looked at interventional studies supplementing EPA and DHA that had either a male or a female group. So this means that the researchers specifically listed that there were men and women in this study. When we're looking at these two word clouds, there's not a lot that really jumps off the page to me. They actually look fairly similar, and these are very common markers measured in any nutritional science study. We're looking at body mass index, lipid parameters, etc. So this is fairly typical of what you'd see in a clinical study. What we did next is look at studies that were more likely to have a male group. So that means that studies identified having a group of only men in their study. So this could be a study only with men or a group of research studies that only investigated specific subparameters in the male population. And so the themes that we see now look quite different. So we see themes about blood clotting, lipid levels, and lipid mediators. And we also see some data and points about range of motion, blood flow, and oxygen consumption. So, okay, those aren't particularly offensive, but what it means is that men are being used as the model organism. So in terms of looking at effects of these supplements on blood clotting or lipid levels, these are being done in men. And this is especially true in exercise studies as well. So the range of motion, blood flow, oxygen consumption are primarily being done in men as well. So this is kind of telling because when we're looking at a supplement or a drug, if we're looking at the effects of the half-life and the dosage and the effect of exercise or blood clotting, if these studies are still being primarily done in men, this isn't helping us to understand the gender differences in our supplement or medication. So then let's look on the other side and look at interventional studies 3 times as likely to have a female group. And as you can see, it looks pretty different. I don't see anything about exercise there. I don't see anything about blood lipids. What I do see are markers about reproductive health and maternal health. Again, critically important. Omega-3s play a really important role during this time period. However, across the lifespan, we don't see any other areas of health represented here. We only see the period of time during pregnancy and breastfeeding. So a really important gap here, and just to acknowledge that more studies in women from a nutritional science lens will help us to understand differences in reaction and benefits to supplementation, not only of omega-3s, but of other nutrients and supplements as well. Just a few more slides here to go. I wanted to do one step further when we're talking about women's health considerations in lipid science research. And so this image that I'm displaying here, and I'll show it on the next page too, was something that was really, it came forward to me, this paper, during my PhD studies, and I used it in my PhD work. And so this shows changes in lipid levels throughout the menstrual cycle. And I thought this was, well, fascinating because that's a huge amount of variability. If you're trying to look to see if your omega-3 supplement changes triglycerides, well, look at how much triglycerides change throughout the month, regardless of your intervention. And so we do see some gender differences in lipids in the body. So women tend to have higher levels of DHA in their blood compared to men. They also have an increased conversion of ALA into DHA, and this has been confirmed with stable isotope studies. And the purported mechanisms or reasons appear to be related to estrogen, but there's also some evidence that the expression of these enzymes are elevated in women compared to men. So just really interesting thinking about the differences when we're doing investigations. So whether we're supplementing with um, calcium or omega-3s or turmeric, and we're measuring these lipids as a lipid panel, we're going to see big differences across our study data. And so just really briefly to acknowledge that these are changing throughout the menstrual cycle. And for those in lipid research, this might be more important to you. But I think it's thinking about the consistency in the studies. And so the recommendation from this research was to measure cholesterol levels during menses in order for consistent comparisons. It's the easiest phase of the menstrual cycle to identify, and it's going to help the results be less variable. So when we're talking in the research community about how, oh, the data from women is too variable, well, here's a way to really add consistency to the data and to the research. So this is something that I was able to implement during my PhD in one of my studies. And so I was really pleased to be able to put this recommendation into practice and invite my participants to come back for their measurements at a consistent period of time during their menstrual cycle in order to reduce the variability in lipid levels, in order to see a more clear picture if the supplementation was affecting these parameters. Okay. So we've gone through a lot of information. We started really big picture in medical science. We went to talking about inclusion and exclusion of women who are pregnant and lactating. And then we talked about disparity and considerations in nutritional and lipid science research. So now when we're considering all of this information, there was something that struck me that wasn't directly related to the presentation content, but related to the group here today. And that was a statement that said, a homogeneous team produces homogeneous products for a very heterogeneous world. And I've represented an image here of products with omega-3s, but it just really struck me that if we're producing the same type of product, no matter the consumer, whether men or women, younger or older, different life stages, the products have to be different in order to fit the needs of our consumers, and our team has to be different to bring different perspectives and thoughts and considerations to the group. So producing the same type of product isn't going to serve the population broadly. So important to think about how we can translate all of this research into the groups that we're working with and serving. So I wanted to say thank you again so much for the WIN team for inviting GoEd to speak on this really important topic today. I certainly learned a lot preparing for the presentation and hopefully was able to share some of that knowledge and learnings with you today. You can find us online at various different websites. I've also included the clinical study database. So if I've caught anyone who's data and research oriented with that component, I'm happy to talk more about that. I'm also very happy to speak about anything that we brought forward today related to gender and nutritional science, as well as omega-3s. They are my two favorite nutrients, so very happy to talk about those in more detail at any time. So I'm going to pause there and welcome back, Heather.
Well, hello there. That was fantastic, Kaitlin. Really appreciated the insights. And actually went online. I was like, oh, the women's health, at the NIH. And it actually does list a lot of the different conditions and health issues that are really facing women in a greater degree. So things like autoimmune dysfunction. So pleased to see that that is expanding beyond just the reproductive issues. So we've got time for a few questions. I know we had some folks in the audience who were asking, hey, am I going to be able to get this presentation? So we will be sharing the recording, and then the presentation itself will be ready, will be available for our WIN members. And I'd love to ask the question. So it's going to take 132 years to close this gender parity gap. So what are the steps that we can take within the nutraceuticals industry to try and accelerate the process? What should we collectively try and do?
Yeah, and I'll acknowledge right off the bat that I'm certainly no expert on how exactly to do this, but I'm certainly passionate about trying to close this gap. And maybe it was a setup, but I think groups like WIN and other organizations just bringing this information forward. A lot of this information as I was preparing surprised me and sort of shocked me. And I think having an increased awareness about the current state, I think is really important. So where are we now? What's going on? Where do we see the gaps? I think bringing some awareness to that will be really helpful. And then, having initiatives and programs to address some of these gaps. So if we're seeing that, for example, from a literature perspective, if we're seeing that anatomy textbooks are only predominantly representing men and white men, well, what can we do in the next edition of these books? And that to me is an easier change where, okay, we swap one image for another image, and then we can really change the diversity in our learning materials that we're putting forward to medical professionals. And yeah, it's thinking across our organizations that we work in, so to me, the tangible one, the changing of the pictures might be the lowest hanging fruit, but I think there's a lot of other, you know, program and systematic things that will take a little bit longer, but a lot of still attention that we need to give to these topics.
That makes sense. In our webinar last month, we talked a little bit about this idea of role incongruity. And maybe the easiest, the low-hanging fruit, is how do you have more gender balanced teams doing the research because they're bringing different perspectives to the table. What's your thought?
Yeah, something that I didn't get to cover today that we might learn more about in the future is even from a scientific perspective, um, who's writing the paper, I think. And there's been really interesting studies looking at if you blind the authors before you submit the paper, or if you don't, people with female sounding names aren't published as often as people with male sounding names. And so that's even women producing science about something non-gender related are having more trouble getting their work out there. But I think it's continuing to think about, from a research perspective, adding a male and female group, or looking at the effects between men and women. And I think something that I heard on a TED Talk when I was preparing is that, yeah, the whole idea that women were thought to be small men. But there's so many physiological differences. And as from a research lens, like it costs more money to add more people to your study. So it can be expensive to look at these gender differences from a research lens, but I think it's important. So that was kind of the research. But of course, in your work teams, having different perspectives. And if we're thinking about marketing a product to women, we ask a woman what they think of the marketing materials, and if the product, has it actually been tested for women, or does it just have a pink ribbon on it and now it's a product for a woman? So I think that's important too.
Yes, we were having that discussion at Supply Side West, actually, with our panel discussion. Just you need to have more, you need to think about it in the way that you're marketing products. But I also love the idea that you brought out that when we think about women's health, it's not just reproductive health. There's so much more there. So you can't just put a pink ribbon on it. But from our opportunity, what do you see in terms of communication, since that's part of what you look at as well, to broaden the focus, to think about women's health as more than just the reproductive aspects? Are there suggestions you'd make for product development teams and marketing teams that they could address?
Yeah, I think certainly from an omega-3 perspective, we don't want to ignore reproductive health because omegas are such an important component to that life stage. But I think what we're seeing from some of these cardiovascular studies is that women are having different rates of cardiovascular disease. They're responding to medications differently than men. And I think both from a nutraceutical and pharmacological lens, we need to really figure out what's going on, because prescribing both men and women, if you have a man and a woman, both 40 years old, should they really be getting the same medication if they are at risk for heart disease? Maybe not. And that's not something I don't know the pharmaceutical industry as well as I know or getting to know the nutraceutical industry, but yeah, I think we need to, it's easy to say more science, more research because it's expensive and time consuming, but I think we have to slow down and really figure out and understand why we're seeing some of these differences. And yeah, it's continuing to think about when we're having sessions on our nutrients or nutraceuticals, is there data on men and women? Can we start to show that? Do we have the same effects? Is it generalized? And maybe thinking about how we can recommend things in certain population groups if there's data to support that. And maybe if there's not, maybe just calling it out to say, oh, we noticed a gap here. We know that actually I don't feel confident talking about the effects in this age group because I don't have data to support it. So maybe it's being even more transparent with the data that we have available.
Well, I think that, being mindful and holding people accountable certainly will play into it. As you said, clinical research is expensive and it's time consuming. So spending the time at the front end, maybe thinking about when might be the best time of the month to assess something, and is the study population who we're going to be selling to, and making that truly representative from the beginning might be a positive first step. Any final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience today, Kaitlin?
Yeah, I think that from our perspective as omega-3s, and we see benefits throughout the lifespan, and we think that they are important for both men and women, and we want to make sure that we can increase omega-3 intake through foods or supplements. So that's just thinking of our lens and the health implications, but thinking about gender and gender disparity more broadly, for me, it was really a pleasure to be able to research and speak on this topic. It is something that I've always really been passionate about, but haven't had the chance to take a deep dive into. So I look forward to learning more from this group and figuring it out how as an industry and how as researchers we can continue to learn more about the differences and support women in both accessing medical health and services, and figuring out how we can improve health across the lifespan in all of these important life stages.
Fantastic. And again, so pleased that we could actually showcase that clinical study database. I just think the work that you've done there really demonstrates how important it could be across multiple categories and nutrients to understand the depth of the research and identify those white space opportunities. So to you, Kaitlin, thank you. To our listening audience, we're delighted that you have been spending some time with us today. And I'd just like to, let's see if I can get the right thing up here. There we go. If you are coming to Expo West, it would be lovely to see you. We're having a Gender Equity and Nutraceuticals networking event, and that is co-hosted with the New Hope group and Informa that puts on the show, 4 to 6 p.m. at the Arena Plaza. Open to everyone. This is designed to just celebrate the opportunity that we have to promote gender equity across the nutraceutical industry, and we'd love to see you there. You can participate, be a part of Women in Nutraceuticals. We invite you to be a member. If you'd like to learn more about our mission, our vision, and getting involved, please do so at womeninnutraceuticals.org. And that's us for today. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful day ahead.